Shabbat Shalom once again to everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. As you all know, that we are just a few days away from probably the most joyous day in the Jewish calendar, namely Purim. But in the meantime, today is Shabbat Zachor and the Shabbat before Purim, where, as I said before, we make a special point of reading the story of Amalek and how wicked the Amalekites were, attacking us from the rear, picking off the weak and the slow who weren't able to keep up as the children of Israel left Egypt. Now we read this story on the Shabbat before Purim because according to tradition, Haman, the bad guy in the Purim story, was a descendant of Amalek. But the question we have to ask ourselves, who was Haman? And for that matter, who was Achashverosh, Ahasuerus? And what do we really know about the book of Esther and when it was written? Now, the likeliest Persian ruler to have been Achashverosh was Xerxes I. And he ruled from 486 BCE to 465 BCE. Now the Hebrew name Achashverosh probably comes from the same Persian word that the Greek rendering Xerxes comes from. Xerxes would also fit the likely time frame. Now linguistic scholars suggest that the book of Esther was probably written somewhere in the 4th century BCE, so likely less than 100 years after the reign of Xerxes. There are court records from the time of Xerxes with officials named Marduka and Marduku that could also be the source of the name Mordechai. There are no external records, however, with a Vashti or an Esther. And many people thought that Esther was a variant on the name Ishtar, a Babylonian goddess. But a linguistic scholar challenges that idea that Esther is Ishtar based on how we phonologically shift work of Hebrew loan words. So in other words, you can't just take a word and translate it. It has to fit phonologically. And there are shifts that have to be done in order to make those words fit. Now, a leading theory for the origins of the book of Esther is that it was written as an explanation for the holiday of Purim, which Persian Jews were celebrating well before the book of Esther. We know that the Purim celebration existed. But the question here is, how did the book of Esther come in? And so the Persian Jews were celebrating Purim well before Esther was written. But now what we have to ask ourselves is, where did Purim as a festival come from? Now for that, we have a very, very interesting and plausible explanation. As I mentioned earlier, linguistic experts agree that the book of Esther was likely written somewhere in the 4th century BCE, not too long after the reign of Xerxes, who in the 4th century BCE is nearly 1,000 years before Muhammad and the rise of Islam. Long before the Iranians were Muslim. And you know what they were before they were Muslim? They were Persians. And one of the most important holidays on the Persian calendar is Nowruz. Nowruz, the Persian New Year, which falls on the vernal equinox in March, meaning around the same time of the year as Purim. That's when we celebrate Purim, okay? The Ayatollahs in Iran tried desperately but unsuccessfully to ban the celebration of Nowruz because they saw it as a pagan holiday. It predates Islam by 1,000 years. And many of the customs that we have for Purim are exactly the same to the customs that the Persians have for Nowruz, especially having the Seudat Purim, which is the festive meal, and believe it or not, Mishlach Manot, the sending of delicacies to friends. Now, during the 5th century BCE, the time of the Purim story, Zoroastrianism was the official state religion of Iran. The Jews would have considered Zoroastrianism a pagan religion and therefore had nothing to do with it. So there are two competing forces, good and evil. And just as Jews in North America have made Hanukkah into a bigger holiday than it really is in other places, so as to allow us to get into the holiday spirit in December, Purim allowed the Persian Jews of old to have a holiday that let them share in the meals and the festivities around Nowruz without being Zoroastrian. The truth is, it is impossible to know whether there may be a true historical story at the heart of the book of Esther. However, and I wanted to understand this, an absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. So what do I mean by that? Regardless of what did or didn't happen 2,500 years ago, Purim has become an indispensable part of the Jewish calendar, not just for Persian Jews, but for all Jews around the world. The question is why? Why isn't it one of the main featured holidays? And what is it about the story of the Jewish holidays that makes this so unique? Well, you know the story. It fits in line with all the other stories. That old joke that goes, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. Fits totally into that idea. There's much more to Purim, however, than that. The rabbis have derived many messages from the story of Purim. In fact, there's a whole volume in the Talmud called Megillah. And that whole volume is filled with customs that we celebrate on Purim. And the rabbis' midrashic interpretations on the book of Esther. And that's, by the way, something we don't have for Hanukkah. Hanukkah doesn't have its own volume in the Talmud. Now, one of the most important lessons from Purim is one that we can derive from something that's missing in the story. And that, of course, is the explicit presence of God. It doesn't appear in the Purim story. God is not explicitly mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther. What does Esther do? She orders a fast for 3 days before she goes to the king. And it's assumed that the people also prayed, but even that isn't explicitly mentioned. And yet, despite the complete absence of God from the book of Esther, what do? We recite Al Hanisim. We do so in the Amidah and in the Birkat Hamazon. We recite it on Purim. What does Al Hanisim do? It praises God for the miracles and the acts of redemption that he performed in those days. In the version of Al Hanisim that we recite on Purim, it mentions Haman rising up and seeking to destroy the Jews. And even though God is not explicitly mentioned in the book of Esther, we close the prayer as follows. But you, in your abundant mercy, nullified his counsel and frustrated his intention and caused his design to return upon his own head, and they hanged him and his sons on the gallows. So from this, we can see that God is with us. God is a presence helping and supporting us, even in the presence of something supernatural. You know, many Jews recite Al Hanisim prayer on Yom Ha'atzmaut, on Israel's Independence Day. Why? Because of the fact that the Jews prevailed over 5 Arab states who attacked us on the first day of Israel's existence. And I'm sure you'll agree that that is certainly miraculous. Similarly today, Even though God is not making his presence known through a booming voice from the heavens, or through cataclysmic events, bolts of lightning, or through thunder and hail and whatever, we can see God's presence in the way we are dealing with the coronavirus crisis. How do we see that? We see it in the acts of dedication from our healthcare workers putting themselves at risk, and in the truly miraculous fact that we have a safe and effective vaccine being put into millions of arms every day. Only 1 year. 1 year after COVID-19 got on our radar. And then there's another reason Purim has been so enduring over all these years. The Jewish calendar would be incomplete without it. You see, the annual cycle of Jewish holidays brings us through the full range of human emotions. We have times of sadness, we have times of reflection, time for gratitude, and Purim is our time for a special type of joy, and that is simply having fun. The rabbis teach that Yom Kippur, also known as Yom HaKippurim, the Day of Atonement, can be read Yom Kippurim, a day like Purim. So the question will ask, how is Yom Kippur, how can it possibly equate to a day like Purim? The holidays seem to be polar opposites. And that perhaps is the whole point of what the rabbis are trying to drive home. Most Jewish holidays have both a spiritual side and a festive side. Take Rosh Hashanah, for example, or take the Shalosh Regalim, the Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot. We may spend time in shul praying, but we also spend time enjoying the holiday with our family and friends. Yom Kippur, on the other hand, is all spiritual. On the day itself, what are we doing? We're fasting, we're in shul. We're desperate to be sealed for a good year. So it's not a festive time at all. Purim is all about festivities, the festive part. We have that famous commandment to get drunk enough that we can't tell the difference between Haman and Mordechai. It's easy to be spiritual and feel God's presence on Yom Kippur when we're fasting and praying all day, but it takes someone at a higher spiritual level to equally feel God's presence during all the merriment of Purim. But you know what? God is equally present if only we're listening. When the month of Adar begins, joy increases. This will be second year when Purim is not exactly normal. After all, Purim was the last time we were together, and we knew at that time that something not so pleasant was going to happen. And yet, what I want us to do, and try and do, is at least feel the joy of the changing of the seasons, of spring approaching, and with it, the joy of a return to our normal lives coming as more and more people become vaccinated. I wish you not only a Shabbat Shalom, but a Purim Sameach, a happy Purim, and I hope you'll join us on Thursday night. Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. We continue in silent devotion on page 536.